importance of intercultural development as a foundation for community, which I think is very powerful. Not just the university community, but how we build communities out into the province and even nationally. So a really great vision, a vision that's really well grounded in scholarship. So his PhD is in social psychology. And what you'll find today is that you get a glimpse into this very different field, combined with a deep understanding of some of the Indigenous voices that we're listening to more and more closely as we move along the path towards more meaningful indigenization of the University of Saskatchewan. I do want to say that Stryker is a Métis man who lives within multiple worldviews. So he is a champion for community perspective, egalitarian principles, and diversity in Canadian society. Those are a lot of big words, but living those words is a lot more complex than just saying them out loud. And my experiences with Stryker since I came to campus nearly 3.5 years ago now have been of someone who's thoughtful, who meaningfully extends the hand of reconciliation and has an enormous amount of knowledge to share. So I really am thrilled to have Stryker with us today. I don't want to say too much more because I do want to leave him to talk about that very magical thing that is identity. And I really look forward to some conversation and questions after the talk. So Stryker, if I could pass the floor over to you, we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Merci, Dean Cresta. Okay, I'm going to minimize the screen so I can just see what I'm looking at here. And okay, here we go. Tashi, Stryker Calvez, Dishni Kashun. On Michif Nia, La Rivière Rouge, Dishchin. Ma famille, Saint-Laurent, Saint-Pierre-Joli, Manitoba, puis la montagne de Torchu, Oshchiwak. So I've just greeted you in Michif, which is a Cree, is a Soto French language. And what I said was welcome. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a Michif Métis man from the Red River. My family comes from the Saint Laurent, Saint Pierre-Joli, and the Turtle Mountain area of North Dakota. I want to welcome everybody for joining me today and sitting with me today. What I want to do is I take you through a bit of a presentation. It's kind of the path towards reconciliation that I've noticed many people going through, and I want to describe it in terms that are very accessible and honest. So I'm going to give you my version of it. This is not necessarily based purely on scholarship. It's based on lived experience, and Indigenous people really love lived experience, so I hope you enjoy this. So most of you, I'm hoping that everybody recognizes this. When I showed this picture to my 3-year-old son, he saw a superhero mask. And so I joked with him that it was a superhero mask for Métis superheroes, of which he got very excited at. But what it really represents is a Métis flag. And I'm pretty certain that most people today recognize it as such. But it wasn't too long ago in the past that Métis flag was something that people didn't know, didn't identify with. And that's part of the truth about reconciliation. That's part of what we're trying to realize, is that a lot of Indigenous peoples and communities, a lot of the details of who we are has been erased from the consciousness of Canadian society. So when I want you to look at this, I want you to know that this is a symbol of strength and resilience, of beauty, of intelligence and creativity, right? There's many people have heard the story about where this symbol comes from. It's been described to me from some of the elders that I've spoken to, that in the back in the day when they did census taking, when those census takers would meet somebody that they obviously knew was not a white Protestant or a part of the Euro culture, they would put this little symbol next to their name to recognize that they were of mixed blood. All right, so this infinity symbol became the mixture. And I think it wasn't meant to be something, a positive thing, but Indigenous Métis people have reclaimed it as our own. And on one side, I want you to recognize it as my grandfathers that came from Europe. That's the Western culture. And on the other side is my grandmothers, right? They came from a First Nations community, and they came together, and they didn't collapse on top of each other. They maintained their identity and their culture. And X marks the spot, right? X marks the spot where their children lived. And it wasn't those first grandparents that created a Métis culture. It was the children and the children's children. Those are the ones that came together, and they blended their parents' understanding of the world into their own unique language, into their own unique worldview, right? And that is what I bring today, is I bring that experience of living within these two worldviews. X is important because that X in the very center of the flag, it represents an ethical and egalitarian space that exists between two cultures that respect and can even love one another. And love is a key part of this, because X, if you add the O's in there, is an important part of what Métis people are. We're full of love. We're full of love for our lives, for our culture, for our people, for our land, for the places that we live, right? We're lifted up by our sharing of our love for one another, and we share that with you as well. We are not here just to self-serve. We are here to support the communities around us. We've adapted over time to the spaces and places that we lived. And so what I want to bring to this attention is most importantly, X represents what reconciliation could and should look like. So it's important that if we're going to start this journey, all people should start, everybody who's interested should start with understanding who they are. We're all cultured beings. We all come from a place where we've been taught about the world. And while that worldview may seem absolute and absolutely true, as if it's the only truth out there, it is a constructed worldview. And if we learn about our positionality, if we understand it and acknowledge it, it begins to help us understand ourselves, but also ourselves in relation to other people. So as I said, I'm a Michif Métis man, right? I put this picture here of my great-grandfather and great-grandmother who lived on the prairies way back in the early 1800s, right? And there's a story in my family that talks about La Cypress, right, which is my great-great-grandmother. She was running, they were chasing after the buffalo in southern Saskatchewan on the southern slopes of the Cypress Hills. And there was a look where my Abnam was trying to keep up with the other Red River wagons, but his wife was very pregnant. And eventually she looked over after one too many bumps and said, okay, we're stopping. And he could see him sheepishly looking at that trail of Red River wagons that were running off into the distance. And he really just wanted to keep up. But one look at her and she set him in his place. They stopped. She got off, had birth, got back on the wagon, and they chased after the buffalo for the rest of the season. And that's a story that I've heard in my family. And that's who I come from. These are people who are dedicated to doing good things, but they serve each other and their family, and they're strong and resilient and powerful. But if I'm going to acknowledge my Métis side, I also have to acknowledge that I have some French from my grandfathers. I have some Scottish, some Cree, some Saulteaux, and some Mohawk. So I identify as a Métis man because that is where my truth lies. But I'm more of a Michif Français because I come from the Red River area, which is a very strongly dominated by the French and the Saulteaux side. And as you move into Saskatchewan, there's a bit more of a Michif Cree. And then if you go northern Alberta, it's Michif and Dene. So we're also a very diverse culture of people, right? So people tend to think of Métis people as one group, but we're not. We're a diverse community of peoples. But other than my cultural identity, I'm a father and a husband. I have three of the most beautiful people in the world. And you're going to hear me talk about my children all the time because reconciliation isn't for me. Reconciliation is the gift I hope to give my children. I do not want them to have to grow up listening to other people talk about the half-breeds and how much of a problem they were on the prairies until the army came in and put them in their place. I want them to see Métis people as a strong, vibrant community of people, and I want them to see themselves proud and loud. And one of my favorite stories is in my daughter when she was in grade 3, she's now in grade 4, was hearing a story from one of her teachers about Métis, and she stopped the teacher and said, you know what, I don't think you got that right. And the teacher tried to put her in her place and said, what do you know about Métis culture? And she goes, well, I'm Métis. And the teacher said, well, you don't know anything. She goes, well, I spent time with my elder and my elder told me this. And she stood her ground. And that's what I want my children to be able to do, to stand their ground with strength. But she wasn't rude about it. She was educational. She was trying to teach him about something that she knew to be true. And that's what I hope to do, is gift my children with that strength so that they can build reconciliation after I am gone. As you know, I have an applied social psychology degree, a PhD. I used to do research with healthcare and looking at institutions, as in cultural institutions, that either supported or created obstacles for people who come from different cultured places. And I was very excited to be doing this work because I really wanted to create opportunities to support my community. But then in 2015, Peter Stoichev, our president, came out and said, you know what, I'm making indigenization the #1 priority at the University of Saskatchewan. And one of the other things about Indigenous culture, Métis culture in particular for me, is that we're service oriented. We serve our families, our extended families, and our community. It's built into my DNA. And I suddenly had to make a decision whether I was going to continue down my path to stand in the distance and watch and observe, measure, and publish on these experiences, or do I want to step into the foreground and become part of this social experiment? And I chose to become the manager of Indigenous education initiatives at the University of Saskatchewan. University of Guelph is where I got my PhD. I don't know where I'm going with that. So my role here, even though I have the research background and I've done that work, I purposely want to be a part of the solution. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. And it's been quite the journey. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is, in my positionality, is recognizing that I have power and privilege, right? I work at the university. I get paid well. I get benefits. You know, I have security. These are all power. These are all privileges, and it gives me power. But I want you to know that I wasn't born with it, right? I grew up dirt poor. I grew up with a family that had been oppressed. We'd lost our land, not once, not twice, many times. We'd lost our houses, you know, we lost jobs, not because we weren't hard workers, that weren't keeping up with our payments. We lost all those things because we were a Métis. We lost them because racism created opportunities for people to take advantage of my great grandmothers and my grandfathers, and they took advantage of us to the point where we had nothing. At one point in time, we had the entire prairies, the homeland of the Métis. We traveled from all the way from Winnipeg all the way up to the Rockies, and from the south to the north. This was our backyard. And then we slowly got smaller and smaller and smaller until they tried to put us into a tiny little speck of land. So I've worked really hard to move beyond that. And more importantly, I've used my power and privilege not to advance myself and to make myself feel better, but to work it towards supporting my community, right? Giving other people the advantages that I didn't have, to lift them up so that they can be strong and have opportunities that I now have, but worked so hard to get. One other thing I really need to bring up, and I'm sure you've noticed, is that I am white passing. I recognize that and I acknowledge it. It changes how I experience my indigeneity, but it does not make me less Indigenous. I am so proud of who I am and where I come from, but I just happen to look more like my mother than my father. My sister, on the other hand, looks more like my father than my mother. And even though you think white passing Indigenous people might have it easy, we don't. I go into spaces and places where people think that they are hanging out with similar others, and they feel comfortable telling those jokes or making those statements that hurt me. They hurt my soul. They make me tear up. This is racism in its fullest form. And I've experienced it well because I've watched other people tell jokes or make comments. I've heard from my sister how she has to avoid certain social situations where she gets insulted and harmed. Right? I've listened to my colleagues talk about it over the last 6 months. It's become a very prominent conversation in the circles of people I spend time talking about the harm that's been done to them. And so when I bring this up, racism, I want us all to know that racism exists everywhere, including the University of Saskatchewan. Racism happens when people take advantage or feel it's okay to say bad things about other people, or to cause harm, or to withhold opportunities from others. Racism also takes place when people stand by and watch it and don't do anything about it. So I'm asking you, think about all the Indigenous people who live on campus and all of their families. Next time you see something that doesn't feel right, say something. because I know, Lord knows, I do all the time, but I do not want to be the only one. So stand up for me in making our university campus an inclusive space. So, that was pretty heavy. So I'm going to shift gears here and talk about a little bit about reconciliation. You know, too many people see reconciliation as this square peg that has to be pounded into a round hole. You know, they tend to see things as simple terms, try to minimize the complexity of it, just make it simple as possible, something you can check off or something that you can do. But then there's others. There's others who see it as a way too complex, or as a place that can be, that maybe is going to be forced upon them. So rather than saying this isn't a good fit on the one side, they're feeling like they're going to get pounded into that hole no matter what, and it's going to make it happen. I want you to understand that this is not reconciliation. This is the fear-based understanding of something you don't know. Reconciliation isn't about harming other people. As an Indigenous person who's come through, whose family and ancestors have come through hundreds of years of harm and prejudice and oppression, we are not planning to reverse that and become the abuser. That is not Indigenous people. We are loving, caring people. What we care about is how people treat others, how they treat our family, how they connect to the community and give back to the community. That is who we are. And that is what we hope reconciliation will be one day. Right? So this is what I think is reconciliation, right? If each one of us is a blade of grass, like the sweet grass we have up on here on the screen, each of us has our own shape, our own identity, right? Reconciliation is about encompassing positive attitudes of respect, humility, openness to others, curiosity about what you don't know or don't understand, and engagement in learning more, right? There is a strength that comes from supporting each other and learning from each other, right? If you think back to that X, where X marks the spot, you could also see that X as a braid. When you take those two cultures and you braid them together, you create something that's much stronger, that can withhold much more tension and can navigate bigger and stronger things. So when I see reconciliation, I don't see something that's scary. I see something that's beautiful. But I don't want us to become one. Nowhere did I ever mention that I wanted those two circles to collapse on top of each other and become one circle. Indigenous people love their culture. They love who they are. They love where they come from. And I'm assuming that you all love who you are and where you come from. And we should not dismiss that. Part of it is where we get our strength. It's where we find our stability. It's where we figure out how to see the world and work with the world. If we could come together and create the Métis flag, create a sweetgrass braid like we see here, we can support each other without having to lose who we are. Some of you might think that this is difficult, but I'm going to beg to differ. How many people here spend time in interdisciplinary teams? How much better is your teamwork when you bring different perspectives together and you use those perspectives to look at the phenomena or the problem and try to solve it, right? Think about quantitative research, how much better it became with qualitative research, right? It is a different version, a different view of the truth, right? And if you really want to hit home, think about your families. You can't tell me that everybody's family is the same. They have different personalities, different abilities, difference is everywhere. And yet as a unit, as a family unit, we are strong and we are vibrant and we are capable of surviving and looking after each other and having better lives because of our connectedness to each other. So I don't want you to think of difference as a challenge. I just want you to see it as an opportunity. Reconciliation will heal us all and make us stronger if we let it. Now, speaking of families, I'm certain most of you have sort of learned from now that we as Indigenous people, we see the land as our mother. So I call her my great-grandmother. I call the sky my great-grandfather. And when I make my prayers, I pray to great-grandmother and great-grandfather, because when I look at the horizon and the circle that I see with my own eyes, grandmother owns half the circle. That's where my egalitarian principles come from. Grandmother wouldn't exist without grandfather, and grandfather would have no purpose without grandmother. And so I see that as important. And I put up these pictures here on the screen because I want you to see the beauty of Saskatchewan. right? If you look at that land in the sky, it's dynamic, it's beautiful, it's vibrant, it's strong, it's rugged, it's diverse. I know everybody has a favorite place somewhere because I've used that as one of my exercises in the work that I do. We all have a connection to land. It speaks to us in different ways. And when you think about the diversity of land here in Saskatchewan, I also want you to recognize that Indigenous peoples are of that land. We don't own the land, we're not on the land, we're of the land. When you see the shapes of the land, when you see the differences in the land, I want you to see differences in culture, differences in language, differences in ideas, differences in practices. Indigenous people come from different places and they have different ways in which they see the world, and it all comes from our mother. She teaches us different things. And that's really important to understand, right? Because when people think about how diverse it is, they think, well, why is it that Indigenous people have all these cultures and languages in Canada? And that's because the land in Canada is quite diverse, right? From coast to coast to coast, right? From north to south, east to west, Canada is an exceptionally diverse place. And when you're an Indigenous person and you're of the land, and your language has been taught to you through the land and the plants and the animals that are close, that are located in that space and place, right? That is who you are. Everything we know comes from that land. And we start many of our opportunities when we start meetings with a land acknowledgement. That isn't a platitude to Indigenous people. That is an acknowledgement of the deep wisdom of the place that gave birth to such a brilliant, beautiful, strong, wonderful community of people. And we acknowledge the land in the way that we want to acknowledge the people that we're working with for some purpose, for a good purpose. And by invoking that spirit into our conversations, we're hoping the wisdom of that place will help us resolve our, get to a good place. So if you think about how diverse Canada is, right, and if you think about the diversity of what we're doing, and we cannot give up our diversity any more than we can make Canada look one place, like one place. As long as Canada stays a geologically diverse space with different weather and different places and different conditions, we too, as Indigenous people, will be diverse. So people have to move away from this idea that it would be so much easier if we used a pan-cultural understanding of Indigenous people, because that would be like paving all of Canada and saying we love living in a parking lot. And I don't know about you, but I don't find them the most spiritually gifted places to be, although they do serve a really good purpose. So the other thing I really want to notice is that Canada is an Indigenous space from coast to coast to coast. As you can see by this map, the Métis homeland is huge. It covers Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and a little bit of the Northwest Territories. But also, more importantly, those gray areas that don't necessarily have treaties or land agreements, those are still in negotiation. Those are places that have yet to been declared as have settled with some type of land agreement. So you can't give up on the idea that Canada isn't an Indigenous space. It's always been an Indigenous space, and it will always be an Indigenous space. And we've been shaped by it by 1,000 years. But you too are being shaped by it right now, right? Nobody can get through a Saskatchewan winter without adapting to the weather, right? Our summers are just as hot. We all adapt to the spaces and places we're at. And if you had 1,000 years, we could then start calling you Indigenous as well. The land speaks to all of us. So I want you to also recognize and start thinking about Saskatchewan as an Indigenous space. You know, there isn't a part of Saskatchewan that isn't covered by a treaty or the homeland of the Métis, right? More importantly, our people are strong and vibrant in all parts of the province, and we are the fastest growing population in this province, right? We have younger children, we are a younger population, you know, with 50% of our population under the age of 22. You imagine as people at the university who cater to the youth and helping them prepare for the futures that they want, the careers that they want, right? More and more of our youth are going to be coming from Indigenous communities. So we need to know that indigenizing the university isn't just a human rights thing, it's just a nice thing to do. It is a necessity, because Indigenous people are coming here no matter what. We've already gone from 1,000 and 1,500 people to over 3,000 Indigenous students in just 10 years. And that will continue to grow and grow and grow, right? Saskatchewan is the second biggest population of the provinces, and we're probably going to surpass Manitoba in the next 10 years to become the #1 largest Indigenous community in the provinces. So Saskatchewan is an Indigenous place, and we need to cater to it, not because it was an Indigenous, because it's always going to be Indigenous. And more importantly, as our population grows and our youth learn from the elders who came before us and who have fought for their rights, learn to use their voice and have created opportunities, the youth are going to stand on their shoulders and they're going to do the same thing. And their children who are going to happen are also going to do the same thing. So Indigenous is not just about space, it's about the place that we hold strong. So university. We don't really talk, and in the last few years, we've talked about the university as an Indigenous space, but more as a present tense thing. And I just want to bring everybody's attention to the fact that, first of all, university is built on First Nations and Métis land. Right? So all of Saskatchewan, University of Saskatchewan exists in an Indigenous space. But right from the beginning, Indigenous people have been part of the university. You had James McKay, who was a governor. He was a lawyer from Prince Albert, and eventually he was born in Red River area, right next to my family. Eventually came to Saskatchewan and became an influential part of the Board of Governors. Right? Then there's Edward Haneke, who Doug Cuthan once described as the Indigenous people's Malcolm X. He became a theologist and became part of the church community so that he could have freedom, because he came out of a time in 1912, I think he graduated, he came out of a time where Indigenous people had to give up their Indigenous rights in order to go to university. So he joined the church so that he could visit communities, because in his time, Indigenous people, First Nations people were not allowed to go from reserve to reserve to talk, to share, to build support and understanding. They were isolated and kept separate from the rest of society in order to maintain control over them. So Edward Haneke created opportunities for people by transferring and moving from place to place as a clergy. Then we have Annie Maud McKay, who's the niece of James McKay. She was graduated from Saskatchewan in 1915 and became part of the library community and stayed and worked there for 44 years, I believe. And she helped create student unions and helped support the community from that position for a long time and became a very influential voice on campus. But you don't see much happening in the university until Canadian society starts to lessen its oppression, right? In the 50s, we start to fight back and we start to claim our rights as Indigenous people. And then as those residential schools are slowly being closed down, as society is starting to open itself up and allow Indigenous people to have their place and space in it, still not equally, but at least they've lessened the chains that held them back. You start to see the University of Saskatchewan engaging in more and more. And what we see here is you see Indigenous education programs being developed for First Nations people. You start to see the Native Law Center get emerged out of the 70s. You start to see Indigenous scholarship happening with Dr. Howard Adams, who became an influential scholar at his time, a Métis advocate. Right. And then as the 80s and 90s come along, we start to see the building of that momentum, right? We start to see the university embracing the realities that Indigenous people live here and we deserve equal opportunity to have an education, to have opportunities in our careers and have quality life. And so you start to see the Native Studies department happen. The university engages and starts to hold a powwow on a regular basis. They create spaces where Indigenous people can live and spend time and connect with each other. Right? In the nursing program, you start to see honorary degrees being given out to Indigenous leaders, right? And that momentum begins to build as in the 2000s, we start to increase the amount of support and programming we're giving to Indigenous people. And as all of us know, in the last 5 years, it's like it started to skyrocket. With them, we've had an increase in Indigenous leadership, not just across colleges, but also in the senior leadership, with the most important one happening recently with Dr. Irini, who's our provost. We've seen more increases in research and we've seen more money coming into the University of Saskatchewan for people who are doing Indigenous research. And the thing that really warms my heart is I've seen an uptick in the amount of people who not only are allies, but who demonstrate their allyship. They hold it strong and they pull it forward and they show people, I am for and with Indigenous people. So these are the changes that are happening at the university. So reconciliation is important because it's for Canada, It's for Saskatchewan, it's for the university, it's for you, but most importantly, reconciliation is for your children. It's for my children, it's for everybody's children. It's about creating a space and place that's more inclusive, that allows people to live the lives that they deserve to live and gives them choice. So I've just painted this really beautiful idea of us all living in harmony. Maybe we could sing Kumbaya. You know, we could really engage in this. But what's really important is that even though reconciliation is a beautiful picture, it's a journey towards something that we could all cherish and enjoy. Why is it so many people feel uncomfortable? Why is it people struggle with the idea of reconciliation? It has to do with fears. And so one of the things I thought was awkward is when I moved into this position, I moved in with a number of people who had education backgrounds. And as somebody with a psychology background, I thought, why am I here? Maybe I'm in the wrong place. But what I learned is in those first early years, most of what I had to deal with were people who had fears. They were a fear of making mistakes, as if making a mistake was going to end everything. There were people who had no idea where to start. They kept looking at Indigenous people thinking, there's too much, it's too deep. I don't want to jump into this end of the pool. Other people thought, you know, this is a waste of time. I've got so much to do. Where am I going to carve out extra time to support this big brand new concept? Other people took a more careful thing. They're like, I'd love to do something, but I'm afraid to insult the Indigenous culture. I'm afraid of making that mistake or doing something wrong, as if that's going to end everything. People thought it was too difficult. And if you looked at the whole picture, it definitely is difficult. Others thought, you know, whatever I can do is just going to be seen as tokenism. And so I'd rather do nothing, right? There were people who had actually tried to do things and they just by accident or by the wrong place, the wrong time, they felt like they'd been personally harmed when somebody had corrected them or maybe even more directly said that they'd done something wrong, right? And then the question is what does benefit me? What does reconciliation benefit me? And I know that fear is not real. And I know I've just described why it benefits everybody, because it creates inclusivity, it creates opportunity, it creates a diversity, which just increases our capacity to build beautiful products, intellectual products that we can use to help guide our Canadian society. So when people have fears, it's just normal that people who are very held high, right? We as educators and as people with PhDs and with education, we hold dear to our hearts our expertise, our knowledge, our ability to be competent and to be strong in our intellectualism. So when you're confronted with something that might be a little bit unstabling or a little bit difficult, we run into all kinds of ways in which people defend against it. Denial is the most common one, where people say, I'm afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm just too busy. I just don't know enough. I wish I had more time. There's no Indigenous people in my life, so I just can't do it right now. There's all these excuses to do stuff. Projection is another one where people have negative feelings, and instead of dealing with their own feelings, they tend to project those onto other people, like Indigenous people. And I've heard so many times, well, Indigenous people don't like me. And I'm like, well, I like you. Right? So there you go. I broke that rule, right? Rationalizations, right? Explaining away their fear. I don't want to make a mistake, so I'd rather do nothing, as if doing nothing is better for Indigenous people. Intellectualization, right? No emotion, focus on the facts. I treat everybody equal. I don't see culture, right? As if equal treatment to everybody is fair. When you have a student who has traveled harder and done more to be in the classroom, treating them like they're equal to everybody else, as if they have role models in their lives to teach them about education and how to navigate the complexities of university. Those things don't exist in many Indigenous communities. And so there isn't an equality that can be shared equally across everybody. And my favorite is reaction formation, when you behave in the opposite. When I meet people who are nervous and scared, but they think the Indigenous people are the most amazing. And I do think Indigenous people are the most amazing, but sometimes people do it to hide the fear, the anxieties that they have. So where does this fear come from? I think it has to do with the fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown is probably one of the most primal fears that people have. They found that 4-month-old infants are afraid of things, right? And they feel fear, and as soon as they feel fear, they react immediately, right? And that's to a strange face or whatever. So you can imagine when, as academics and as people who live in an intellectual space, when we become competent and capable, one of the things we actually fear is being exposed for not being knowledgeable enough or not having the right answer or not being able to do stuff. So when we think about moving into a space or place where we don't know the answers or we don't know much about it, there's a fear there which creates a fight or flight response, right? And when people have that fight or flight response, right, they tend to prefer negative consequences rather than tolerating this uncertainty or to deal with that uncertainty. Fear of the unknown is real. I don't want anybody to think that it's a bad thing. We all have it. It's a universal experience. We all have a fear of the unknown. We all get nervous going into an unknown situation or presenting at a conference that we've never been to a bunch of people we don't know. It is all human, and that is okay. It is the starting point. When you start to realize that you are being impacted by this fear, it is a starting point for learning. But I want to bring everybody's attention. Some people are much more capable of being adaptive to the uncertainty, and other people have an intolerance of uncertainty, right? And by intolerance, I don't mean that you're not capable of understanding and dealing with knowledge. It's just you have this natural tendency to stand back or to resist putting yourself into a position where you might feel an adversive response, or you might feel dissonance, or you might feel uncomfortable. And people who, those people aren't necessarily, we shouldn't treat them badly. We should treat them with compassion. We should treat them with an appreciation of the additional challenge that they need to get over in order to support reconciliation. Right? And we can do that by helping them to see that they haven't lost control of the situation. Help them to see how they can have a sense of control, right? Help them keep away from running away, right, and denying it and escaping from the situation. Help them find a stepping space, a place where they feel comfortable, where they can stop and rest, right? Where they can take baby steps instead of the bigger steps that other people take, right? And more importantly, we need to help them understand that what we're providing them, what we're introducing them to, what we're offering them isn't a threat. It's just an opportunity to learn and to take their time, take their steps towards whatever it is they need to do. And this is how we help people who are less capable of adapting. We do not treat them like they are not right. That is unfair and unjust. And that isn't the road to reconciliation. That's judgment. And we will not judge people in that way, because that is not what we want reconciliation to look like. So this leads us to the heart of the complexity that we find in indigenizing our institutions. I think that oftentimes we hold people to a reasonable level of expectation. What we need to do is open ourselves up to learning, to making mistakes, and to learn from those mistakes, just like we did when we were in our undergrads, just like we did when we were in our K-12. We need to make mistakes in order to learn. And if we open our heart to the idea that reconciliation isn't something that I am going to realize in my lifetime, and my children may not realize it in their lifetime, but if we work hard and we open our hearts and we move towards reconciliation in this good way, in a compassionate way, our grandchildren, my grandchildren, might truly know what reconciliation is. And that's what I want for our institution. I don't want us to feel like if we can't get far enough, why bother? This is a marathon. It will take 7 generations. So I want to take a little bit of a curve here, right? Because I'm talking about how do we institutionally embrace reconciliation. And one of the truths that we need to deal with is that culture is embedded in each of us, but we all have our own version of culture. We all have our own personalities. We have our own interactions, our own different life experiences. So our version and understanding of culture is varied from person to person to person. Nobody holds the same view of culture that somebody else has. So what keeps a society stable, what keeps a society strong in its culture and its values is the institutions. institutions hold strong to a set of values, and those values are what we use to guide our society, make our decisions, prioritize what comes before what. And when we understand that culture is embedded in the institutions, then we start to understand that when we're talking about bringing reconciliation, indigenizing the university, what we're doing is bringing in opportunities for another culture to live and thrive and be whole in an institution that was designed for Western Eurocentric understandings of knowledge. And that is a difficult task. That means that not only do we as individuals have to know ourselves and our positionality as cultured people, but we have to know that our institutions, we have to know the positionality of our institutions. And when we know that, then we can reflect on what is a safe space. How do we create opportunities? Culture is a powerful force. It's not something we can see, but like a fish in the water that doesn't know it's in the water, it's everywhere. We use these institutions as cultural spaces. They stabilize our society and make sure that it doesn't shift around, because changes, dramatic changes for no reason, cause harm. And that is one of the reasons why institutions are the stabilizers of a cultural perspective, right? And if you think about it, culture, we're all born into a culture, right? It feeds our biological needs. It creates safety, right? When we are vulnerable babies, we need stability, we need to be nurtured and saved, right? And we need to look after. So what happens when you live with a group of people is you ensure that you have your own access to food. Even when you don't have food, somebody else has food, we share the food. So we're social beings, and being social, we interact with each other. But in order to survive, we need to have the same values in order to make the same decisions, so that we're not always in constant conflict when we come up against obstacles or challenges, right? We can move in the same direction. And institutions teach us that. Every time we interact with an institution, it reminds us what the best way to do it, or the right way, or the appropriate or the appreciated way to do something is. And as further you get into an institution like the university, the further you have to become a culturally fit, right? Undergrads work really hard to get into grad school, and you have to prove yourself to get into grad school. And then if you want to become a faculty member, then if you want to become tenured faculty, in each stage of that game, we need to fit and meet the needs of our discipline and our institution and demonstrate our cultural fit. And that's an important part of reinforcing the cultural perspectives. So if you can think about how strongly our institution will shape individuals to meet that cultural fit, so that the stability of our institution stays there. Now you imagine bringing in this other culture. It is complex. It's going to take time to figure out, because one group of people, the dominant group of people who live at the university, have accepted and worked hard for their right to be in an institution. And the idea of bringing in something unknown can be threatening, it can be scary. And so we need to recognize that our positionality as an institution is going to affect how we move forward. But we don't want to create unbalance. We do not want to harm the institution, but we do need to change it. And we need to change it in a way that supports the people who live in it and survive in it and thrive in it. We just need to open up the doors a little bit more, broaden our understanding of the different values in order to provide other people opportunities to survive and to thrive in this institution. So what do? I've just sort of laid out a beautiful picture of reconciliation. I've talked about the challenges individuals have. I've also talked about the challenges an institution has as a cultured spaces. So where do we go from here? As you probably figured out, you need to know yourself. You need to know your positionality. And that is not a difficult thing. It just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of conversation with people. So I would suggest that people start by developing an awareness of who you are, where you come from, what are your values, what are your beliefs? How do these things shape your identity, and how important is your identity to you? And we don't all have one identity. We have different identities. In my positionality, I talked about being Michif. I talked about my cultural diversity. I talked about my children, my wife. Then I talked about my PhD, right? And then I talked about how society treats me. There's these layers of positionality that we need to understand. But when you start to understand yourself and the diversity of roles and identities that you have in your world, and how you can still have that integrity, you're starting to get towards positionality. And then the next step is to anticipate, to know that if you have all these complexities within you, and that is part of who you are, it's part of your strength and your weaknesses, but it's definitely who you are, then you need to appreciate other people and their own complexity, right? So you start to accept the differences of people, right? And not just the differences within a cultural group, right? You got to start to think that there are other cultural groups. There's also different people with different abilities. Lord knows I cannot throw a baseball to save my life, right? But my son can. So he's always reminding me he's better at these things. And I accept it's just who I am. But when you do that, when you start to accept other people's diversity, then you begin to see and understand that there are different perspectives. And like others, you can begin to take those perspective taking moments to recognize this is how I see it. But if I look at it from someone else's point of view, would it be the same? What would be different? And we start to see the world in a more authentic, more truthful manner. And that helps us. But we're still going to have to work on getting past our judgmentalness. Every human being is judgmental. It's a human nature. It helps us survive by quickly assessing a situation, knowing what's happening. We need to be able to quickly jump to a conclusion. The problem is when you're part of a society that's treated Indigenous people poorly, you're going to run into times when you make a choice or you make a judgment and it's not accurate. You think about the 100 years of colonization, all that harm what was done to Indigenous people. Well, similar harm was done to non-Indigenous people. You were taught myths and false truths about Indigenous people. You were told that we were lazy, that we were unintelligent, that we weren't capable, and that isn't true. I'm living fact of that, and I've got 1,000 other people that would demonstrate it. We are some of the smartest, brilliant, creative, artistic, caring people in the world. And I'm not in competition with other people. I just care about my community, right? So these stereotypes that colonization gave to non-Indigenous people are a part of our social fabric, and we tend to make those judgments really quickly. So if you think about it, we need to take perspective taking, but one of the perspectives we have to look back is what have we been told about a people that is true and what isn't true? And most of it isn't true if it comes from a colonized space, because everything that was taught there was done to keep us down. And that isn't what we're after anymore. We're after lifting us up. So when you start to do this and you start to see the differences and you start to work in a non-judgmental worldview, then I want you to look around and notice that other people who are on the same path, that maybe not as far as you, or people who are further along, they need support. They don't need your sympathy. They need your empathy. One of the things I see is that non-Indigenous people, they don't necessarily reach out and help other non-Indigenous people on the road to reconciliation. There's a tendency right now to let Indigenous people be the ones that help nurture and care for allies. But what I've tried to do in the last few years is help allies to support themselves, to build up their own strengths, to know their own truths, and to help each other so that Indigenous people can be released to look after themselves and their own families in the same way. So knowing your positionality and knowing how you relate to other people is a very important part of this road towards reconciliation. So we start with the person, now we're going to go to spaces, right? And you know, you're all on this moment right now where you're learning about culture, you're learning about your awareness of culture and so forth. So you're on the stepping stone, right? So it's important in your cultural awareness to be curious, right? That's the starting point. Be curious about what is it Indigenous people are doing. Why is it they do it that way? How come it is done that way when I do it this way? Is that right or wrong? I don't know. Let's see about, be curious, ask questions, don't be afraid. And as you build that up, as you build your curiosity, you're going to start to become more sensitive to culture. You're going to become more sensitive to the different ways in which you can see the world. And you start to respect that a little bit. And you get more comfortable with these differences and you start to become very excited by them. And when you get excited by them, you start to be very careful not to step on other people, right? To squash their ideas, to squash their process or their practice. It's important to do so because you want them to treat you in the same way. And as you get better at that, your cultural competency will take off. You become curious, active, and more importantly, you get involved. You start to do things. You start to express yourself in ways that are not just for the privileged white cultural group. You start to show yourself in ways that it can be understood by the dominant group and all those other groups of people that live around that dominant group that want the same thing. And when you're doing that in a good way, when you've developed up your ability to support a culturally intercultural space where everybody is treated fairly and equitably, right, you're starting to create cultural safety. Never in this journey from cultural awareness to cultural safety will you ever feel like you know anything. But like somebody who has earned a PhD or a strong education, you will start to become more comfortable at knowing, I don't know this, but I bet you I can learn it. And that's really the truth of what we want to create for an inclusive space, so that when you start to go from space to space to space, and one space you know really well, but the next space you don't know well, your confidence to be able to navigate it, your willingness to learn about what that space is supposed to be like increases. And that's when we start to create a university that in all the places that all the students go and all the places that our staff and faculty go, we can be appreciated and know that we're going to be loved and appreciated and valued. So if you want to build relationship with reconciliation, we need to move past just having safe places for Indigenous people. For the longest time, we created the Gordon Oaks Red Bear Center for Indigenous people. We had these little spaces in different college spots where Indigenous people could go and be safe. But if that's the end point, what you're really saying at some level is that you'll be safe there, but when you come out here, you're going to have to be strong. You're going to have to be strong in all the classrooms that you attend and all the events you go to, right? So we need to move past creating safe spaces. We need to make the spaces that Indigenous people spend time in all safe. Right? You also need to know yourself in relation to Indigenous people. Now, it doesn't mean you need to go out and know every Indigenous person, know some Indigenous person. You just need to start building your understanding of yourself in relationship to Indigenous people. And that can be through books, it can be through movies, it can be conversations you have with other allies who talk about Indigenous people. I always recommend people thinking about what's really valuable and important to me, what's part of my life, what's part of my worldview or experience of life that's really important to me, and then look for something similar in Indigenous culture. When you have something that's really precious to you and you find a version of it in another culture, it's a starting point for understanding. It's a starting point that's strong and powerful, and you can grow that and nurture it like a tree and then spend time and build out from there. It starts as a strong starting point. So you take steps in that way to start supporting reconciliation, because the thing that you found in Indigenous culture or you found with an Indigenous person, it becomes a starting point for supporting your way towards reconciliation. And then I always suggest that you need to give back what you learn, right? Don't absorb it. Don't take it all in and go, you know, I feel good about this. Help other allies, other people who are interested in allyship, other people who are interested in reconciliation, help them understand your view. There is no one view. I've met thousands of people who've talked about their views of reconciliation, and I've yet to see one that's exactly the same as somebody else's. Everybody has their uniqueness. One of the things I think is really hard for many people to do because they're worried about being seen as insensitive is to have fun, to laugh. I can tell you, when I spend time with my Indigenous colleagues, when we spend time together, we laugh nonstop. We make fun of each other. We make fun of our weaknesses. We make fun of our strengths. We joke around. We live moments that would make us cry. You'll often find us laughing, because laughter keeps us present. Laughter makes us keep everything in perspective, and it keeps our hearts open and the fear at bay. So I just recommend that everybody who goes down this road find a way to do so in a fun way. Find a way to enjoy yourself. Do not be scared. Do not let the fear be the reason why you're going down it. Find the joy in your life, and then find the joy in Indigenous peoples that has a similar ride, and then take that ride to the destination, wherever that might be. And to show you what I mean, I've put down this link. I did a TED Talk, and I hate promoting it because it's absolutely the most embarrassing thing I've ever done, but it is a joking manner of looking at reconciliation through teenage dating lives. And if you want to see me trying to have fun in awkward experiences, I suggest you go see my TED Talk. So if you think about it, indigenization starts with you and then it moves outward. So it starts with the personal and you have to move it into your professional. You can't go professional and move it in personal. Without that personal connection, without that personal investment or engagement, you will never reach it in any good way. But there are lots of ways in which you can do good. You can start that journey and get involved. The most important thing is to remember that you lead from where you're at. You can be at the very beginning. There are hundreds of other people who are at the very beginning or have yet to start, so you have a lot to offer them. So anywhere you are along this journey, you have something to ask. But I ask you to be curious. Ask how, when, why, what's going on. Ask questions. That's what elders are for. That's what they do. That's their role, is to help teach. And as teachers, when they get asked a question, it's an opportunity for them to help you move along the path that you have, right? Be compassionate about your learning. Recognize that there are challenges that we all experience in our fears, in our tolerance levels, and in our lack of knowledge, right? We want to be experts. We want to feel competent because we've worked so hard in our careers to be seen as competent, but there are areas where we have to acknowledge that we're not competent, and that's okay. Our learning experiences can be awesome, and they don't have to be big steps. They just have to be baby steps, right? And don't wait. Waiting till tomorrow means there's another day that Indigenous people have to live under an oppression, a system of oppression. You know, it's been generations of work for us to get to the point we are. We would love to get moving along faster. We recognize that non-Indigenous people are just coming to terms with reconciliation, recognizing that this is a needed thing in Canada. And so we recognize it'll take you time, but please do not take any longer than you need to. Take risks. It's better to take a little bit of a risk now and make a mistake and learn from the mistake and be better tomorrow than to wait till tomorrow to make the mistake and wait till the next day to be better at it, right? And then more importantly, be a role model for reconciliation. So this is an old term that keeps popping up from time to time. Reconciliation, people tend to think about it, absorb it, go have conversations about it, but what it's really meant to do is to create action. Actions don't have to be big, they just have to be small, right? Knowing your positionality is action. Knowing that you want to create inclusive spaces in classrooms or in labs or in research or anywhere is action, right? So move there. So if you're a faculty member, you know, start thinking about what is your teaching philosophy? How is it you approach each class? And remember how I said you can look at your at Indigenous culture. If you think about your teaching philosophy, there is something similar but that you like to do, something that's really core to who you are that exists within Indigenous culture. Once you start to explore and find those things, you start to learn about how Indigenous people absorb and do things in the same way that you like to do it. It's easier to come back and think, okay, well, this is how I do all my courses because this is my philosophy, right? I'm going to adjust my philosophy to be more inclusive of Indigenous people because this is what I've learned. And all of a sudden, the roadmap for what can be changed in your course becomes obvious because your philosophy infuses every step of your journey through a course. And so once you indigenize your philosophy, the program of laddering in Indigenous understandings and ideas becomes very natural. And don't think about just your classroom, think about your research, right? Indigenous people need help in building up their culture again, building up their society, building up their communities. It doesn't mean we want you to come in and parachute in and help save us. What we want you to do is approach the front door, ring the doorbell and say, hey, I do this kind of thing. Are you interested? No, thanks very much. Go to the next door. Eventually you will find somebody. I have been on research projects that have been worth millions of dollars and it started in the exact same way. Me reaching out, starting a conversation, finding someone who has something in common with me, and then us collaborating on what that could be, and then that finding out how that supports the community, and all of a sudden the community comes on board, and next thing you know, I've got this enormous project that can be supported by community, and the funding just becomes natural. Staff also need to be a part of this as well, right? You know, remember I talked about the institution as a cultured space. Staff members are much more closely connected often to policies and procedures. They understand the practices that exist. They interact with the students and other people across the university. They understand the system as it operates. For them to understand that and to think about where are the opportunities to change, where do we make this thing less exclusive and more inclusive, and staff have that power. They're valuable, important parts of our university, often underlooked. And I think staff have the ability to really shape and change the lived daily experiences that people have at our university. So I suggest people look for ways to make their spaces more inclusive, have conversation with the diverse community that live on campus, both staff, faculty, and students, and ask them what works for you and what doesn't, and is there anything I can do to change that and make it better, more easily acceptable for you. So these are ways in which we can all move towards reconciliation. So I have no idea. I've been rushing through that as fast as I can. I believe I just made it to the 5. I think I got it in within an hour, but I don't know if I have enough time. I'm going to leave you here with some quotes to inspire people to think about things, and I'm going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, just turn your mic on and ask. And I will stay here for the next little bit because I know I've probably gone over time.
Stryker, thanks so much. Somebody did tag me as we were going through to remind me that I missed the land acknowledgements because I was so excited to welcome you. So I do want to start the question period by saying that we are gathered virtually on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. This is a very important part of all of our ENGTALKS, and ironically, we remembered it for the first two. I want to promise you that. So I know it's important to Stryker that we recognize that. I want to thank him for a really great overview. And I do want to encourage people. We will be posting this on YouTube. And there's a slide partway through where Stryker talks about knowing your positionality. And I'd really encourage people to go back to that one and really spend some time reflecting on it, because there's a lot of depth and there's a lot of value in working your way through some of that. I do want to extend our time until 5:15 for those of you who are able to stay. I know that there are often difficult questions, so I'm going to suggest that we turn off the recordings so that people feel able to ask whatever they would like to. We will monitor the chat, we will monitor videos coming on, and we'll monitor hands going